My husband severed ties with his toxic mom and sister after they boldly demanded our dream home for my jobless SDL, her lazy gamer husband, and their 6 kids. My relationship with my family has always been complicated, and it started to spill over into my marriage, which isn't fair to my wife. Growing up, I was the golden child in my mom's eyes. My dad was always busy with work, so my mom and I spent a lot of time together. My sister, Sarah, didn't get the same treatment. I know my mom loves both of us, but it's obvious she's always favored me. I think Sarah felt that growing up, which is why I've always tried to be a good older brother to her and be there for her whenever she needed me. But over time, both my mom and Sarah started crossing lines that just weren't okay. Let me give you an example. When my wife and I first started dating, I was fresh out of college and still living with my family. My parents had given me my own floor in the house for privacy, so I'd sometimes invite my wife over to spend the night. One morning, Sarah barged into my room without knocking while we were still in bed. We weren't exactly dressed for company, but she acted like it was no big deal and started talking to me about random stuff. My wife was understandably uncomfortable, and honestly, so was I. I get that I was living with my family, but is knocking on a door really too much to ask? Apparently, it was. After that incident, my wife told me she wouldn't come over unless I installed a lock on my door. I agreed, and the next time Sarah tried to barge in, she found the door locked. She started yelling, jiggling the handle, and banging on the door, demanding to know why it was locked. When I finally let her in, she stormed into the room and accused my wife of being the reason for the lock. She called my wife some nasty names and insisted that siblings shouldn't have secrets from each other. I told her the lock was my idea because I didn't want her walking in on us while we were sleeping. She didn't take it well and blamed my wife for coming between us. My wife, who hates confrontation, excused herself to the bathroom while I tried to calm Sarah down. Later, I apologized to my wife and promised I'd talk to Sarah about her behavior. The next weekend, Sarah gave a half-hearted apology, claiming she needed to talk to me urgently that morning. I made it clear she wasn't to disturb us like that again, and she nodded, but I could tell she wasn't happy about it. That wasn't the only time Sarah acted weird toward my wife. If we disagreed about something, even something small like what movie to watch, Sarah would chime in and say I should date someone with similar tastes. She'd make snide comments about how my wife and I weren't a good match, and when I'd shoot her a look, she'd just smirk. She also had a habit of asking my wife uncomfortable questions about her past, like why her ex broke up with her, or if she wasn't good enough for him. Once, she even said my ex-girlfriend was prettier than my wife. It was clear Sarah was trying to get under my wife's skin, and it worked. One day, my wife had enough and fired back, saying she liked her ex's family better because they weren't nosy and overbearing like mine. That shut Sarah up for a while. My mom wasn't much better. When my wife and I first got together, my mom ignored her. But once she realized we were getting serious, she started acting like my wife was stealing me away. She'd ignore my wife at family dinners and events, and when I'd call her out on it, she'd brush it off. She even called my wife stuck up and spoiled because she went to a private school, while my mom was a public school teacher. At one point, my mom tried to talk me out of marrying my wife, saying I could do better. I didn't listen, of course, and proposed anyway. When my mom and Sarah found out, they freaked out. They called my wife and told her to give me back the ring and end the relationship. My wife refused, and when they realized they couldn't convince her, my mom changed her tune and told her to be the best wife she could be. Sarah, on the other hand, accused my wife of being a gold digger and threatened to expose her before the wedding. I was furious when my wife told me about all this. I confronted my mom and Sarah, but they doubled down, insisting my wife wasn't good enough for me. I told my wife to ignore them and reassured her that I loved her no matter what they thought. We decided to pay for our own wedding, and when my mom offered to cover half the costs, we declined. I explained how hard we'd worked to save for the wedding, but instead of being proud, my mom acted hurt, saying she felt like I didn't need her anymore. My dad, on the other hand, was supportive and never had an issue with our relationship. To keep the peace, we let my mom organize the rehearsal dinner, which she agreed to. But as the wedding got closer, things got worse. One night, Sarah invited herself over for dinner, saying she missed me. My wife and I were living on our own by then, so we agreed. During dinner, Sarah started ranting about how much she hated cheaters, calling them useless. Then she looked straight at my wife and asked how it felt to be one. I was confused until Sarah pulled out photos of my wife and one of her coworkers, accusing her of having an affair. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah was accusing my wife of cheating on me with her coworker, Zach. She waved around photos of the two of them, insisting she had proof. My wife and I were both stunned. The picture showed them having lunch together at work and chatting in the office parking lot. Completely normal stuff. I asked Sarah what her problem was, and she started yelling about how my wife was clearly unfaithful and didn't deserve me. My wife tried to explain that Zach was just a colleague, but Sarah wouldn't listen. She kept shouting, saying she was just looking out for me and didn't want me to marry someone who would hurt me. I'd had enough. I told Sarah to leave and not come back until she could act like a decent human being. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. My wife was upset, and honestly, so was I. I couldn't believe my own sister would try to sabotage our relationship like that. I reassured my wife that I didn't believe a word of Sarah's accusations and that I trusted her completely. But the damage was done. My wife was hurt and angry, and I didn't blame her. Things only got worse from there. A few days later, my mom called and started lecturing me about how I needed to think carefully before marrying my wife. She said Sarah had told her about the affair and that she was worried I was making a huge mistake. I told my mom the truth, that Sarah was lying and trying to cause trouble, but she didn't seem to believe me. She kept saying things like, "Are you sure you know who you're marrying?" and "I just don't want you to get hurt." I finally lost my patience and told her to stay out of it. She hung up on me, and we didn't talk for weeks after that. The wedding planning was stressful enough without all the drama from my family. My wife and I tried to focus on the positive, but it was hard. We'd worked so hard to save for our dream wedding, and now my mom and sister were doing everything they could to ruin it. My dad was the only one who seemed to be on our side. He called me one day and told me not to let my mom and Sarah get to me. He said he was proud of me for standing up for my wife and that he couldn't wait to see us get married. His support meant a lot, but it didn't make up for the way my mom and Sarah were acting. The final straw came a few weeks before the wedding. My wife and I had just bought our dream house. We'd been saving for years, and we were so excited to finally have a place of our own. But when my mom and Sarah found out, they flipped. They called me and demanded that we give the house to Sarah and her family. Apparently, Sarah's husband had lost his job again, and they were struggling to pay rent. My mom said it was my responsibility as the successful sibling to help them out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told them no, but they wouldn't take no for an answer. They kept calling and texting, saying things like, "Family comes first," and "How can you be so selfish?" I finally had enough. I told my mom and Sarah that if they couldn't respect me, my wife, and our decisions, then they didn't need to be part of our lives. I said I was done with their toxic behavior and that I wouldn't let them ruin my marriage. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. My wife and I deserved to start our life together without all the drama. The wedding was beautiful, and my dad was there to walk me down the aisle. My mom and Sarah didn't show up, but honestly, it was a relief. We didn't have to worry about them causing a scene or saying something hurtful. It was just me, my wife, and the people who truly cared about us. We've been happily married for a few years now, and we haven't spoken to my mom or Sarah since. It's been hard at times, but I don't regret my decision. My wife and I are building a life together, and that's all that matters. I knew I had never been unfaithful to Jacob since the day we started dating, so I was both confused and curious about why Sarah thought I was having an affair with my coworker, Zach. When I looked at the photos she was waving around, they seemed completely harmless. Zach and I were close, sure, but only because we'd started at the company around the same time. We'd bonded over helping each other avoid mistakes and getting chewed out by our boss. Zach even had a girlfriend, and Jacob knew all about him. My phone didn't have a lock, and I'd always been upfront with Jacob about my coworkers. These innocent moments Sarah had captured were twisted into something they weren't. Proof of an affair that didn't exist. I felt a surge of frustration at her attempts to ruin my reputation and damage my relationship with Jacob. Before I could defend myself, Jacob stepped in. He was visibly upset and asked Sarah why she'd been following me around, taking pictures without my consent. Sarah tried to justify herself, saying she was just trying to protect her brother because she didn't trust me. She claimed I wasn't of their status and accused me of marrying Jacob for his money. Jacob shut her down, telling her that her accusations were baseless and that she was creating drama out of nothing. He tried to reason with her, asking her to stop spreading lies, but Sarah wouldn't back down. She kept yelling that Jacob needed to open his eyes and see the obvious affair that was happening. I tried to explain that Zach and I were just co-workers, but Sarah refused to listen. The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, I'd had enough. I told Sarah I was going to file a police report against her for stalking me and taking my pictures without permission. Her face went pale, and she asked if I was serious. I told her I had all the evidence I needed. She'd followed me, taken photos without my consent, and was now using them to spread lies. Sarah panicked and started pleading with Jacob, saying she'd only done it to protect him. She begged him to talk me out of filing a report, claiming it would ruin her career and future. I stood my ground and told Sarah the only way she could save herself was by staying out of my life. She looked at Jacob, hoping he'd side with her, but he supported me completely. He told Sarah she should be grateful I was willing to let it go, considering how wrong her actions were. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed to stay away from me. From that day on, she and I haven't spoken. Jacob still has a relationship with her, but she's never dared to confront me again. The second incident happened the night before our wedding, during the rehearsal dinner. My mother-in-law had insisted on organizing the event and refused any help from us. But when we arrived, it was clear she hadn't put much effort into it. The dinner was held at a park with plastic tablecloths on picnic tables and cold Mexican food. To make matters worse, my mother-in-law got drunk and started acting inappropriately with the guests. She complained about how stressful the wedding planning had been, even though she hadn't contributed financially or helped with any of the arrangements. Eventually, my father-in-law had enough and escorted her out. Sarah tried to defend her mother, but my father-in-law wasn't having it. The whole thing was a disaster, and I started to panic that my mother-in-law and Sarah would ruin the wedding too. That night, Jacob and I had our first big fight. I told him he needed to uninvite both of them because I couldn't risk them causing a scene at our wedding. Jacob refused at first, saying his father would keep them in line. But I was adamant. I told him if he didn't uninvite them, there wouldn't be a wedding the next day. Jacob was shocked, but he finally understood how serious I was. He called his father early the next morning and told him his mother and sister weren't welcome at the wedding. My father-in-law wasn't surprised and promised to make sure they didn't show up. My mother-in-law and Sarah called Jacob repeatedly, tried to convince him to let them come, but he stood his ground. He told them that after everything they'd done to hurt me, he didn't feel comfortable having them at the wedding. My mother-in-law accused me of coming between her and her son, but Jacob didn't budge. I felt bad that my father-in-law couldn't come because of his wife and daughter, but my guilt disappeared when I found out from Jacob's cousins that Sarah and my mother-in-law had planned to wear white dresses to our wedding. They'd even encouraged other female family members to do the same, saying there was no reason the bride should be the only one in white. I was horrified by how low they were willing to go just to hurt me. In the end, our wedding went off without a hitch. No one tried to upstage us, and it was a beautiful day. Since then, my mother-in-law and Sarah have stopped talking to me entirely, which I'm perfectly fine with. They still invite Jacob over for dinners and special occasions, but I don't mind. My father-in-law, on the other hand, has been kind to me, and we've stayed in touch. A few years later, Jacob and I bought our dream home. It's a big house, and we were thrilled to finally have a place of our own. His parents and Sarah came over for a small housewarming celebration, but I avoided them by spending the day with my family. Then, out of the blue last month, my mother-in-law called me. It was the first time we'd spoken since the wedding, and I was caught off guard. She asked how I was doing, and then casually brought up how big our house was for just the two of us. Her words stung because Jacob and I had been trying to have children for years, but due to infertility issues, we hadn't been successful. Jacob had always been supportive, telling me he loved me and that we didn't need children to be happy. My mother-in-law then dropped a bombshell. Sarah was pregnant with her sixth child. I was shocked, especially since Sarah's husband was jobless and refused to help around the house. He spent all day gaming while Sarah worked multiple part-time jobs to support their family. My mother-in-law explained that Sarah couldn't keep working during her pregnancy and suggested that Jacob and I give up our house for her and her family. She said it was too big for a childless couple like us, and that Sarah deserved to live in a bigger home. I was speechless. I asked if she was joking, but she was dead serious. She even claimed that Jacob had already agreed to it. I knew that wasn't true. Jacob and I shared everything, and he would have told me if he'd agreed to something like that. I told my mother-in-law that the house belonged to both of us, and no one could move in without my consent. I offered to let Sarah and her husband stay with us for a few days, but I refused to let them move in permanently. My mother-in-law started yelling at me, saying it was my duty as a daughter-in-law to make room for Sarah and her family. She even said that if I agreed, all our past issues would be forgiven. I snapped. Sure, I'll let them have our place, I said. But we're still paying the mortgage, and I know Sarah and her husband won't help with the bills or the payments. So, unless you're planning to cover all the costs, the answer is no. My mother-in-law was silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by my response. Then she started yelling again, saying I was being selfish and that family should always come first. She accused me of not caring about Sarah's struggles and claimed I was trying to keep Jacob all to myself. I'd heard enough. I told her firmly that Jacob and I had worked hard for our home, and we weren't going to give it up for anyone, family or not. I also reminded her that Sarah's situation was the result of her own choices, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix her life. When I hung up, I was shaking with anger. I couldn't believe my mother-in-law had the nerve to ask something like that. I immediately called Jacob and told him everything. He was just as shocked as I was. He assured me he hadn't agreed to anything and that his mother had no right to make such a demand. He promised to handle the situation and told me not to worry. Later that evening, Jacob called his mother and confronted her about what she'd said to me. She tried to play the victim, saying she was just looking out for Sarah and that I was being unreasonable. Jacob didn't back down. He told her that our home was ours and no one else had a right to it. He also made it clear that if she or Sarah ever tried to pressure me again, he would cut off contact with them completely. My mother-in-law was furious, but Jacob stood his ground. After that conversation, things quieted down for a while. Sarah and her husband didn't move in with us, and my mother-in-law stopped calling. Jacob and I focused on our life together, and I was grateful to have a husband who always had my back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the drama. A few months later, Sarah gave birth to her sixth child. Jacob and I sent a gift, but we didn't visit. We didn't want to give Sarah or my mother-in-law the chance to bring up their ridiculous request again. For a while, it seemed like they'd finally accepted that we weren't going to give up our home. Then, out of nowhere, my mother-in-law called again. This time, she didn't bother with small talk. She got straight to the point, saying Sarah and her husband were struggling financially and needed help. She asked if Jacob and I would be willing to lend them some money. I was hesitant, but Jacob and I talked it over and decided to offer a small loan. We made it clear that it was a one-time thing and that we expected to be paid back. Sarah and her husband accepted the money, but we never saw a dime of it again. Every time we asked about repayment, they had an excuse. Eventually, we gave up and wrote it off as a loss. It was frustrating, but we decided it wasn't worth the stress of constantly chasing them down. Over time, Jacob and I learned to set firmer boundaries with his family. We stopped giving them money and made it clear that we wouldn't be manipulated or guilt into doing things we weren't comfortable with. It wasn't easy, and there were times when Jacob felt torn between his loyalty to me and his love for his family. But he always chose me, and that meant everything. Now, years later, Jacob and I are still happily married. We've built a life together that we're proud of, and we've learned to navigate the challenges that come with having a toxic family. My mother-in-law and Sarah still try to stir up drama from time to time, but we've learned to ignore them. We've created a home filled with love and respect, and that's all that matters. After my mother-in-law and sister-in-law left our property, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. It had been a long, stressful day, but I was proud of how Jacob and I had handled the situation. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly on the same page. Jacob apologized to me for not setting firmer boundaries with his family sooner, and I told him I was just glad he was finally standing up for us. The next few days were quiet. Jacob and I spent time reconnecting and talking about how we wanted to move forward. We both agreed that we needed to focus on our own lives and not let his family's drama consume us. Jacob also reached out to his dad to let him know what had happened. My father-in-law was understanding and apologized for his wife and daughter's behavior. He assured us that he would talk to them and try to keep them in line, but he also made it clear that he supported our decision to cut contact if necessary. A week later, we received a letter in the mail from my mother-in-law. It was filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. She claimed she hadn't realized how much she'd hurt us and begged for another chance. Jacob and I read it together, but we both agreed that her words didn't match her actions. We decided not to respond. If she truly wanted to make amends, she would need to show us through her behavior, not just her words. In the meantime, I installed the cameras around our property, just as many of you had suggested. It gave me peace of mind knowing that if my mother-in-law or sister-in-law ever showed up again, we'd have evidence of their behavior. I also started looking into legal options just in case. I didn't want to take any chances. Life has been peaceful since my last update. Jacob and I have settled into a routine that works for us, and we've been focusing on our future. The adoption process is moving along, and we're both excited about the possibility of becoming parents. It's a big step, but feels right. We've also been working on strengthening our relationship, making sure we're on the same page about everything. Communication has been key, and it's made a world of difference. My father-in-law has been a steady presence in our lives, and we're grateful for his support. He's been respectful of our boundaries and hasn't pushed us to reconcile with my mother-in-law or sister-in-law. He's even started therapy to deal with the stress of living with them, and he's been open with us about his progress. It's been good to see him taking steps to improve his own life, even if the rest of his family hasn't followed suit. As for my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, we haven't heard from them since the letter. It's been a relief, to be honest. The cameras around our property have given us peace of mind, and we haven't had any unexpected visitors. We've both agreed that if they ever try to contact us again, we'll handle it together and stay firm in our decision to keep them at a distance. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. A few weeks ago, my father-in-law called with some unexpected news. He told us that my sister-in-law had finally left her husband. Apparently, she'd had enough of his laziness and lack of support, and she decided to take control of her life. She and the kids were now living with my mother-in-law, and my father-in-law was helping them get back on their feet. Jacob and I were both surprised by the news. We'd always hoped Sarah would leave her husband, but we never thought it would actually happen. My father-in-law asked if we'd be willing to meet with Sarah to talk things over. He said she'd been reflecting on her behavior and wanted to apologize for everything she'd done. Jacob and I talked about it for a long time. We both agreed that we weren't ready to let Sarah back into our lives, but we also didn't want to shut the door completely. We decided to meet with her, but only on our terms. We set up a meeting at a neutral location, a coffee shop near our house, and made it clear that this was just a conversation, not a reconciliation. The day of the meeting, I was nervous. Jacob and I arrived early and found a quiet corner where we could talk. When Sarah walked in, she looked different. She seemed more subdued, less entitled. She sat down and immediately apologized for everything she'd done. She admitted that she'd been jealous of Jacob and me and that she'd let her mother's influence cloud her judgment. She said she was working on herself and wanted to make things right. Jacob and I listened, but we didn't make any promises. We told her that we appreciated her apology, but that rebuilding trust would take time. We also made it clear that we weren't going to let her or her kids move in with us, no matter what. Sarah nodded and said she understood. She said she wasn't expecting anything from us. She just wanted to apologize and start fresh. The conversation was tense at times, but it ended on a positive note. Sarah thanked us for meeting with her and said she hoped we could have a better relationship in the future. Jacob and I left the coffee shop feeling cautiously optimistic. We knew it would take time to see if Sarah's changes were genuine, but we were willing to give her a chance from a distance. Since then, Sarah has kept her word. She hasn't asked us for anything, and she's been respectful of our boundaries. She's even started therapy to work through her issues, which is a big step for her. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, has stayed out of the picture. She hasn't tried to contact us, and we haven't reached out to her. It's been a relief, to be honest. As for Jacob and me, we're doing well. We've learned a lot from this experience, and it's brought us closer together. We've both realized how important it is to set boundaries and prioritize our own happiness. We're excited about the future and all the possibilities it holds. To everyone who's followed this journey, thank you for your support. Your advice and encouragement have meant the world to me. This will be my final update, but I'll always be grateful for the love and kindness I've found here. A few weeks passed, and things remained calm. Jacob and I focused on our lives, enjoying the peace and quiet we'd worked so hard to create. We even started talking about the possibility of adopting a child in the future. It was something we'd both always wanted, and now that we were free from his family's drama, it felt like a real possibility. Then one evening my father-in-law called. He sounded upset and told us that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law had been arguing nonstop since their visit to our house. He said they were both struggling to accept that Jacob had cut them out of his life, and they were taking their frustration out on each other. My father-in-law admitted that he was at his wit's end and didn't know what to do. Jacob listened patiently, but he made it clear that he wasn't willing to reopen the door to his family. He told his dad that he loved him and appreciated his support, but he couldn't keep sacrificing his own happiness for people who refused to respect him or his wife. My father-in-law understood and said he wouldn't push us to reconcile. He just wanted us to know what was going on. After that conversation, Jacob and I talked about how he felt. We both agreed that we didn't want to be pulled back into his family's drama, but we also didn't want to completely cut off his dad. He'd been the only one who'd consistently supported us, and we didn't want to lose that relationship. We decided to keep in touch with him, but maintain our distance from the rest of the family. As the months went by, life settled into a new normal. Jacob and I continued to build our life together, free from the constant stress of his family's demands. We even started the process of adopting a child, something that brought us both so much joy. It felt like we were finally moving forward, leaving the past behind us. Then, one day, we received another letter from my mother-in-law. This time, it was different. She didn't beg for forgiveness or make excuses. Instead, she simply apologized for everything she'd done and said she hoped we could find it in our hearts to forgive her someday. She also said she understood why we'd cut her out of our lives and that she wouldn't try to contact us again unless we reached out first. Jacob and I talked about it, and we both agreed that it was a step in the right direction. We weren't ready to let her back into our lives, but we appreciated the sincerity of her apology. We decided to keep the letter as a reminder of how far we'd come. Now, as I write this final update, I feel a sense of closure. Jacob and I have worked hard to create a life we're proud of, and we're not going to let anyone take that away from us. We've learned to set boundaries, stand up for ourselves, and prioritize our own happiness. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. To anyone out there dealing with toxic family members, my advice is simple. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. You deserve to be happy, and you don't owe anyone your peace of mind. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. Thank you to everyone who supported me through this journey. Your kind words and advice have meant the world to me. This will be my final update, but I'll always be grateful for the love and support I've found here.